You were the one who kept showing up. You noticed the small things. You remembered what they said 3 weeks ago and brought it up at exactly the right moment. You created space for them, adjusted your pace for them, quietly swallowed the anxiety that crept in whenever they went silent for a few days. And then one morning, no blow-up, no final conversation, just a message that felt like cold water, or worse, no message at all. Just a slow disappearance that left you standing in the middle of something that used to feel real, wondering how something that started so warm could end so quietly. This channel, Deep Healing, exists precisely for this, for the people who loved carefully and still ended up confused, searching, and honestly a little lost. Now, before we go anywhere, let's name what's actually happening inside you right now, because most content skips this entirely and jumps straight to tactics. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls back or outright rejects you, your nervous system doesn't process it as a simple disappointment. It processes it as a threat, and not a small one. The part of your brain responsible for survival, the same circuitry that fires when you're physically in danger, activates in almost identical ways when social connection is severed. Researchers at UCLA mapped this out and found that rejection registers in the same neural regions as physical pain. That's not a metaphor, that's your actual biology. So, the first thing you do instinctively, you move toward the pain to stop it. You send the message. You explain yourself. You apologize for things you're not entirely sure you did wrong. You find softer versions of your needs and present them carefully, hoping that if you just come across as less, they'll come back. And right there, in that instinct, is where most people accidentally make things significantly worse. Not because reaching out is wrong, but because of what that reaching out communicates to someone wired the way an avoidant is wired. Let's back up and look at where avoidant attachment actually comes from, because once you understand the origin, the behavior stops looking like rejection and starts looking like protection. A child who grows up with a caregiver who is emotionally inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, sometimes overwhelmed by the child's emotional needs, learns something early. They learn that expressing vulnerability creates unpredictability, that showing need leads to either being dismissed or creating distress in the person they depend on. So, the nervous system adapts. It builds a kind of internal self-sufficiency. It stops reaching outward for comfort and starts suppressing the signal entirely. Fast forward to adulthood, and that same person can be genuinely drawn to someone, can feel real warmth, real pull, and still find that as closeness grows, something inside them tightens. An invisible alarm. And their response to that? Alarm isn't cruelty. It's the only regulation strategy they've ever known. Distance. So, when you come in after the rejection with explanations and reassurances and carefully worded messages showing how reasonable you are, what lands on the other end isn't, "Oh good, she's not a threat." What lands is more closeness, more emotional volume, and that accelerates exactly the thing you're trying to reverse. None of that is your fault, but it is your reality, and knowing it changes what you do next. Here's something nobody warns you about. There's a very specific window right after avoidant rejection, and what you do inside that window quietly shapes the entire trajectory of your own healing, whether they ever come back into the picture or not. Most people use that window to audit themselves, to scroll back through conversations looking for the moment they were too much, to run every interaction through a filter of what did I do wrong until their self-perception is in pieces. And look, honest self-reflection has value. But there's a difference between reflection and interrogation. When you interrogate yourself after rejection, you're operating from the assumption that the distance was about your inadequacy, when what's far more likely and far more useful to recognize is that the distance was about their capacity. Those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. Consider a guy named Daniel. He'd been getting close to someone for about 5 months. She was brilliant, a little guarded, but when she let him in, it felt like something rare. Then she got quieter, then more surface level in her responses. Then one day she said she didn't think she was in a place to keep going forward. Daniel's first draft of a response was 4 paragraphs long. It addressed everything he thought might have gone wrong. It was thoughtful, measured, kind even, and he almost sent it. Instead, he closed the app and went for a long drive. Not to think about her. He'd been doing that for weeks, to notice what he'd been ignoring about himself. Because somewhere in those 5 months, he'd quietly abandoned several things that used to matter to him. Hobbies he'd let slide, friends he'd stopped calling, a rhythm to his own days that had dissolved the moment she became the center of his focus. The rejection hurt, but the drive woke something up in him. He'd stopped being a full person and had started being a person organized around waiting. Waiting for her texts, waiting for confirmation, waiting to feel like enough. That recognition didn't fix the pain, but it gave the pain a direction. Right, so let's get into the actual structure of what happens after avoidant rejection. Because there are 3 distinct phases almost everyone moves through, and being able to name them means you're steering rather than just surviving. Phase 1, the activation surge. This is the immediate aftermath. Your attachment system is in full alert. Every instinct is screaming to close the gap, restore the connection, return things to how they were. This is the phase where the risky moves happen. The multiple messages, the showing up somewhere casually, the late-night texts that start with, "I just wanted to say." The activation surge isn't a character flaw. It's a physiological response. Your body doesn't know the difference between "person I care about has become distant" and "I am actually in danger." Both fire the same alarm. So you get this surge of urgency that feels completely rational from the inside, but often reads as overwhelming pressure to the person on the other end. Especially an avoidant, whose system is already primed to interpret emotional intensity as a signal to retreat further. What actually helps in this phase isn't suppressing the feeling, it's redirecting the energy. Physical movement, not as a distraction trick, but because your nervous system needs discharge. The activation has nowhere to go. A walk, a run, anything that gets you out of your head and into your body starts to metabolize some of that urgency without pointing it at the avoidant. Phase 2, the mental loop. A few days in, the acute panic softens into something more insidious. The endless mental replay. You're not sending messages anymore, but you're having 17 imaginary conversations a day. You're crafting the perfect thing you should have said. You're analyzing their last few interactions with you, looking for the exact moment it shifted. This phase can last a very long time if you let it, because it has the texture of productivity. It feels like you're working on something, but the loop doesn't produce answers. It produces more questions and more evidence for whatever painful story you're already telling yourself about why you're not lovable or not enough, or why people always leave. What moves you out of the loop isn't willpower. It's redirection that actually costs you something, meaning it has to require enough of your attention that the loop doesn't have room to run in the background. Creative projects, challenging learning, social situations that demand your presence. The goal isn't forgetting. It's interrupting the pattern long enough that it loses its grip. Phase 3, the opening. This is quieter. It doesn't announce itself, but at some point, could be weeks in, could be longer, there's a small shift where the questions stop being about them and start being about you. Not in a self-blaming way, but in a genuinely curious way. What was I actually getting from this dynamic? What part of me found the uncertainty familiar? What does it say about my own patterns that I kept showing up for someone who kept stepping back? This phase is where real change lives, not the performing of moving on, actual movement. Now, the real question underneath all of this: what do you actually do with the avoidant? Do you reach out? Do you go completely silent? Do you try to have one honest, clear conversation? Honestly, it depends on 2 things. how established the connection was, and whether you're reaching out for clarity or reaching out because your nervous system is still trying to close the gap. If the connection was newer, a few months, things hadn't fully settled into committed territory yet, then genuine withdrawal is the most honest and ultimately most effective response. Not silence as a strategy, not going quiet, hoping they'll notice and come chasing. Real withdrawal, where you're genuinely putting your attention somewhere else because you deserve to. An avoidance deactivation system runs on one fuel source, the perception that intimacy is threatening. When you stop pursuing, you remove the trigger. You're no longer confirming their nervous system story that closeness creates chaos. And sometimes, not as a rule, but genuinely sometimes, that absence of pressure is the first time they've been able to think clearly about what they actually want. But whether they reach back out or not almost stops mattering once you're genuinely living your life again, rather than building it around their potential return. If the connection was deeper, real time invested, real attachment built, then a single honest conversation can have value. Not a negotiation, not an attempt to change their mind. Just a clear, grounded expression of where you stand, followed by actual space. Something like, I care about what we had, and I'm not going to pressure you, but I also can't stay in uncertainty indefinitely. Then you mean it. You leave the door cracked if you want to, but you stop waiting in the hallway. Stay with me here, because this next part is the piece most people genuinely aren't ready to hear. But it's the piece that changes everything. A huge number of people who fall hardest for avoidance aren't randomly unlucky. The dynamic isn't a coincidence. Anxious and avoidant attachment are almost magnetically drawn together, and the pull isn't random chemistry. It's a wound recognizing a familiar wound in someone else. Someone with an anxious attachment history. Someone who learned early that love is something you have to earn, chase, or constantly prove yourself worthy of. Often misreads avoidant behavior as depth. The mystery feels meaningful. The inconsistency feels like a puzzle worth solving. The moments of warmth, when they come, feel more precious because they're rare. And so, the chase itself starts to register in the nervous system as intimacy, even though it isn't. A woman named Sasha, who had been in 2 consecutive relationships with emotionally unavailable men, described it this way. She said every time someone was consistently kind and available, she found herself pulling back. But the moment someone was uncertain or hard to read, she was completely locked in. She thought that meant those men were just more interesting. What it actually meant was that inconsistency felt like home. That recognition didn't come from someone telling her. It came from her own quiet honesty when she finally stopped long enough to notice the pattern. And when she did, when she could genuinely see that the anxiety of the chase was what she'd been confusing for connection. The avoidance stopped being the problem to solve. She became the project. That shift, that is power. Let's get concrete about what taking your power back genuinely looks like, because it gets talked about vaguely all the time, and that vagueness makes it useless. It starts with stopping the external audit and starting an internal one. Not what did I do that pushed them away, but what did I keep tolerating that I shouldn't have? Not how do I become someone they want, but what do I actually want? Separate from them entirely. It means setting a hard boundary with yourself around checking their social media. Not because you're trying to be strong, because every time you check, you hand your emotional state over to whatever you find there. You're basically giving them a remote control to how you feel without them even being present. It means being honest with the people around you about what you're going through instead of performing fine. The isolation that comes with trying to look unbothered is one of the biggest things that slows healing down. You don't have to make someone else your therapist, but you do have to let real people see that you're struggling, and this one matters. It means sitting with the grief of it without immediately converting it into a plan. The grief is information. It's telling you that you care genuinely, that you opened yourself up, that you took a real risk. That's not evidence of weakness. That's evidence of someone who is actually capable of love. The avoidance inability to meet that capacity is not a verdict on your worth. One more thing before we close, and it's something worth carrying forward. The version of you who comes out the other side of this, who does the actual inner work instead of just surviving until the next connection comes along, that version doesn't just heal from this specific situation. That version fundamentally changes what they attract and what they tolerate. When your sense of self stops depending on someone else's consistency to stay intact, you stop finding unavailability magnetic. Not because you've hardened, not because you've lowered your expectations, but because the need that made the dynamic feel familiar has been addressed at the root instead of just managed on the surface. A guy named Eli spent 2 years after a particularly painful avoidant dynamic doing exactly this kind of work. Not obsessively, not with the goal of becoming some emotionally perfect version of himself, just honestly. Bit by bit, he stopped needing the chase to feel alive. He got better at recognizing early on when a connection had the same familiar tension. And instead of leaning in harder the way he used to, he started asking a different question. Am I drawn to this person, or am I drawn to the dynamic? That question, asked honestly, is one of the most clarifying tools you will ever have. You came into this video in some version of pain, maybe fresh, maybe weeks old, maybe something you've been carrying quietly for a long time. And I want to acknowledge that directly, because this kind of hurt doesn't get enough credit for how genuinely disorienting it is. You're not dramatic for feeling it deeply. You're not weak for wanting them back. You're not broken for falling for someone whose patterns made closeness feel impossible. You're someone who loved honestly in the direction of someone who wasn't ready. What you do from here is your choice, but you now have more to work with than you did before. If any piece of this stirred something real, write it in the comments, even something short. Sometimes naming where you are is the first move. And if you know someone quietly carrying something like this, pass this along. The most powerful thing you can offer someone in pain is the feeling that they've been genuinely seen.